Well, hello, Clenton.
Hello, Nick. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm awake. Yeah, new baby, 6-week-old baby, not sleeping very well. But that's the sympathy card played already. Yeah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. On about this new lockdown and what that might mean. So, second wave, I've got to reach for hope, a bit more hope. So,
yes, today's the 12th of October. So tonight, listeners will finding out what the new lockdown restrictions are. So we just had a fascinating discussion with 3 people today. Rita, Goodhead and Angela Gault, who are both freelance facilitators and coaches in their own right, and have put together a course called Let's Break It Down, exploring how to create the conditions for having conversations about racism and exploring the background to it, the history, and what we can be doing differently. And they were also joined by Natalie, Scarlett, who has recently established a community interest company called the Black Heritage Support Service in parts of Birmingham, looking at some of the health inequalities people have been facing during COVID.
For me, it was an absolutely brilliant conversation and discussion. The things that resonated for me were some of the things that I'm really passionate about, from a lady called Bren Brown, who talked about the power of vulnerability. And, they were talking about healing, building bridges, how power and privilege work. And to me, just reminded me of Bren Brown's, Dare to Lead and the call to courage. So, and it was just fantastic. A warm welcome to our guests and to Changing It Up. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us who we've got on the show today?
Certainly will. Hi, everyone. Hey, it's lovely to see a screen full of people today. We've got 3 guests with us today, Clenton, don't we? We've got Rita Goodhead, who's a freelance facilitator working in the community sector in schools. And between her and Angela, who is a personal and business coach, Angela Gault, they're running a new series of workshops called Let's Break It Down. And we've got Natalie Scarlett with us, who is the founder of a community interest company called Black Heritage Support Service in Birmingham and beyond. So welcome to you all. It's lovely to see you all. Lovely to have you all with us today. So we always start our interviews with some quick fire questions to get to know everyone a little bit. We've got 2 questions for each of you today because there's 3 of you. So I've got the first one for you, Natalie. Do you have a favourite meal?
I do. I'm biased. It's a Jamaican meal. It's oxtail rice and peas, plantain, a bit of coleslaw on the side. That would be my last meal ever.
And who's making that for you?
Mum. It's a mum or an auntie, has to be. I don't attempt things like that because it's a no-go zone for the average, person.
For life, or do you think one day you'll have reached that level?
I think I have to get over the 50 mark. It's not right if you do it before then.
Thanks, Natalie. Rita, my question to you is, have you got any pets?
I don't have any pets. I'm actually allergic to cats. And I feel like if I was to ever have a pet, it would be a cat. So I feel like as I'm allergic, that would probably never happen. But no, don't have a pet, have never had a pet, yeah.
Angela, I've got a question for you about hobbies. Do you have any hobbies?
Oh, hobbies. I do like a bit of non-contact boxing. I used to dance. That's how me and Natalie knew each other. We used to break dance together. But now I'd say I've shifted over into some boxing.
Fabulous.
Ah, interesting. I bruise very easy. Natalie, could you tell us your favourite TV show?
I think Fresh Prince always wins, I think. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Good choice.
Okay.
Rita, if we were able to go on holiday again, where would you be going?
I mean, my dream location is probably Bora Bora. But, I mean, given the situation and the fact that it will probably take about 24 hours to get there, I don't think that would happen anytime soon.
And this is to you, Angela. This has kept me up all night thinking about this question. What would you do with £1 million?
Oh, I go to Bora Bora.
And I'm coming with you.
I'm actually not joking because my screensaver on this laptop is Bora Bora. So I'm out, guys. I'll see you in about a decade. Yeah, oh, sorry, Rita's coming with me. Actually, you're all coming. Let's go.
Yeah, come on. Bring us all with you. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for that. I'm really interested to hear about your work. Natalie, would you mind telling us a little bit more about your work, please?
So I founded a support service for the Black community as a direct response to, initially as a direct response to COVID-19. And initially it was looking at some of those disparities between the Black community and other groups. And primarily we're an advocacy service. So it was looking at some of those health negligences that the Black community were experiences throughout COVID. I just had a lot of people contacting me saying that their aunts and uncles and various members of the families were taken into the hospital and weren't being given adequate treatment when they were calling 111. For example, the elders in the Black community were calling 111. There wasn't enough tact by the advisors. The assessment didn't cover some of those initial onset symptoms that people in the Black community have, which was found in the report done by the government. Some of our first symptoms were different, and that wasn't covered in the 111 assessment, leading to misdiagnosis and a lot of people in the community being treated and looked at a lot later than they should have been. So initially it was kind of looking at some of those issues and see if we could set up a support line that would be manned by advisors, professional Black advisors. So it was really important that this was community led, so that some of those barriers would be understood by the advisors that Black people face. We're trying to look at some of those core socio-economic reasons for the Black community being higher risk of catching COVID. So yeah, the virus is there, and there's lots of reasons why it's attacking particular groups, but those kind of root causes have always been there. They've been there for centuries, and we've been dealing with it for decades, and they're still there. Some of those socioeconomic factors of areas where Black people populate, were more dense, less access to resource and good healthcare, hospitals being over capacity, under resourced, pre-existing medical diseases being prevalent amongst the Black community is not genetic, it's not biological, it's economic, it's the food that's around in those communities, that's available in those communities, it's low income. There's lots of reasons. So we're really trying to kind of look at some of those issues and seeing what we can do as a community to become a bit more self-sustainable, to do what we can with the resources that we have.
What's your view around how structural inequality might play out in communities?
I think that's the basis for, why we have the issues that we have. It's structural, it's systematic, it's been there for centuries, and it's difficult to remove those systems and barriers. It's institutionalized, so it will take such a long time, and it will actually take collaborative working from the people with power, people at the top, from the white community. So it's not something that we can kind of fix in a short amount of time, but I think we're going in the right direction in terms of raising awareness, talking about it, protesting, asking for things that we need, educating each other. I'm really liking this climate at the minute of a lot of our white allies coming forward and saying, look, I want to help, I want to be a part of making change. What do I need to do to make that happen? And unfortunately, it's kind of the powers that be, the gatekeepers, that do make some of these big decisions. But how can we take some of those positions? How can we get into some of those positions to make these changes? So, even though it's systematic, even though it's structural, I think, moving strategically, collaboratively, I think that's the best way for me personally for how we might see change. And it's coming, we're seeing change happen, even though we have those figures on the far right and those groups that might stir things up in the wrong way, I do think we are starting to collaborate a little bit more, like in this podcast with the people that we have here. I think we're moving in the right direction in order to break down those barriers.
Rita and Angela, you're kind of at the forefront of trying to drive some of this collaboration and thinking. How are you using your Let's Break It Down workshops to create those conditions that Natalie describes that we need to get to have these conversations?
Sure. So when it comes to Let's Break It Down, I feel like what we're trying to do is we're really trying to take a more rounded approach just to the whole issue of inclusion, diversity and racism. So it's not just necessarily about, teaching people about the history of racism, the history of systemic racism and what's happened in this country. It's also getting people to think on a more deeper level about the things that drive these behaviors. So I think one of the things that we do in these workshops that might stand us out from other people, and this is where Angela's background as a life coach comes in as something that's very useful, is we go into the psychology aspect of it. We go into the, what are the processes that happen in the brain that actually will cause people to be defensive? What are the cognitive processes that will happen that actually lead to stereotyping, and then actually letting people know and reminding people that these processes are normal, these thoughts are normal. It's not necessarily about the first thought you have, but it's about how can you change that first thought? How can you make sure that your second thought is one that is not discriminatory, is not racist?
Yeah, I think one thing we're also trying to do, just in terms of Rita and myself hosting and facilitating these workshops, is that between us, we're both trying to exemplify the way the conversation, what we need in the conversation, as Natalie just mentioned. It's not an issue, affecting the Black community that needs to be driven by Black people. As white people, we're the cause of it. So we need to be involved in this conversation, because you can't make change if only half the people are talking about it. So it's kind of, I think, trying to remind people that you're going to feel uncomfortable having these conversations, and that you're going to be challenged, and you're not going to like what you probably think about sometimes. And that's the main reason people get defensive, is because it's highlighting things in themselves that they don't want to face because of what it might mean that they are, and not necessarily what they are, but the association of what they think that means, and then what kind of person they are. So it's really trying to have an open conversation, even the way we're demonstrating the content as we're going through the workshops, so that it's like, hey, as me, having this, I've had to confront these things. I'm still in a learning process. I'm still on a learning journey. And then one thing we really try and leave off, once we sort of give some resources for them to think about and look through, and we come back and do another workshop, because we don't want it to be standalone. Otherwise, it can be very much tick box exercise. We want people to be able to revisit, to build on knowledge, keep educating themselves, but also to be kind of patient and kind to each other as well, because we, when we move along an educational journey, we forget where we start. And you're going to constantly be coming across people who are at the beginning of that journey, who are not going to have the right language or be thinking in certain ways. And if you react to them in oh gosh, why don't you know this? Well, then that's going to shut them down, and they're going to feel like they don't have a space to be able to ask questions and make mistakes, because we do. That's how we learn, and it's, as long as you're intentionally trying to improve yourself, and you're like, I want to learn, as long as you're coming with that attitude, that's what we're really trying to promote. And as I said, the key thing is you have to create a safe space for that. We've all in some way been in safe spaces where we've been able to have these conversations, but also been in spaces where you get shouted down, and then, and so it's really looking at why. I think the key thing that drove this was, why do people react the way they react, and how can we start to look at the reactions and what's coming out of that. If we can kind of start to tackle that a bit, then we can start to have a productive kind of place to think and have conversations.
Thank you for sharing that, Angela and Rita. I quite like the term where you talked about patience and being kind, and creating a safe space. What does creating this safe space look like when you're doing your sessions?
So in terms of what a safe space actually looks like, it can look very different if we're doing it virtually and if we're doing it in person. I guess some people might look at it as, I don't know if the word ground rules is the right or wrong word to use, but just knowing that it's an environment where you can feel comfortable in expressing yourself, where you can feel comfortable in asking questions, because I feel like a lot of the time when we have these kind of workshops and we have these kind of conversations, especially if they're led by people that you don't know or you're not familiar with, you might feel hesitant to ask a question, to metaphorically raise your hand if we're doing it virtually or in real life. You might feel hesitant, even if you're in a group of people that you know very well, that they might judge something that you say. So it's just about breaking down those barriers from the start and just making people feel as comfortable as possible. And there are many different ways to do that. And I feel like as facilitators, one of the ways that we can facilitate a safe space too is just by being very open with the group from the get-go too, being very open with our experiences. And it's not just about, us educating them.
I'd like to know more about how you unpick using the power of vulnerability, which is a concept from Bren Brown, who's a psychologist in Australia, has brought this term about, and how power and privilege, how do you work with power and privilege to break down and bridge, to have that dialogue?
Yeah, I think there's two key things you've just asked in that question. One in terms of the power of vulnerability, and then power and privilege. And I think they go hand in hand, because for people to even just hear the word privilege and power and understand how it impact, how it's related to them, you have to be in a space where you're hearing what those definitions are and how it actually applies to you. And I think a key thing we do in the workshops is really just going to some really, really basic neuroscience of how the brain works, how we receive information, why we react in a defensive, like fight, flight, freeze mode response when we hear something that is in direct contravention to maybe our experiences, what we've been taught in schools. So it's like, it links into cognitive dissonance, and that makes people uncomfortable because they're saying, here's some truth I'm being told is truth, but it goes against the truth that I know. And then we go into very individualistic mode. So we think, oh, it's I'm wrong, and by going into trying to just show people very basics of how the mind works, it's showing like, no, this is people, this is how the brain functions. And because of the way systems are set up in terms of institutionalized racism, etc., you can then understand, we're not blaming you as an individual, this is how society has conditioned us to think. These are some of the outcomes. And once everyone kind of realizes, oh, okay, it's not my failings as an individual. This is like, I've literally breathed this in since the moment I've been born without realizing, hopefully creates a listening environment so that you can then start to understand someone's perspective. Because when we go into especially fight mode, you go into, oh, I see what you're saying to me. It's an attack on myself, my identity. So you just start defending back. So you can't listen to someone if you're talking over them or listening to respond. So once people can just listen, even if it makes them uncomfortable, then we can start to broach these topics of power and privilege and actually what it means. Like, what does, when you hear privilege, and this particularly, for example, white privilege, what does it mean? And that's where we found that once people kind of go, oh, so you're not saying like white privilege means that I've had the best upbringing and da-da-da. It means that you haven't had your race been a factor in, without you even knowing, in sort of affecting life chances or opportunities within the system and within the country that we live in. So I think that's how for me and Rita, we really try and bridge that gap. So that it's like, how do we create the listening environment so that when we talk about these big words that get people quite riled up, hopefully it just makes everyone be a little bit more balanced to just want to hear what those definitions are, and then conversation can start to flow.
I've learned a huge amount through this conversation, and it's been really, really insightful to hear you all share your experiences from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different angles you're coming at with this, but all with a common kind of aim here. Can we finish off just by hearing one thing from each of you about what you're kind of hopeful for?
The one thing that I've seen change, I'm 34 now, and it's only recently this year that I've seen like acknowledgement from white people, from my peers. Racism has always existed, but it was never acknowledged. There was never a movement in such a collaborative way in my lifetime. that's leading to significant change, and that's given me hope for a better future, because you know, when people hear black in a title, or, you know, are in the Black Heritage Support Service, everyone kind of gets scared of that word. Like Angela said, it's like, you know, why'd you have to say why'd you have to say the colour, why'd you have to say black? People are afraid of it. And you know, I would hope that we just get to the point where we wouldn't have that reaction, where people would be understanding about why these conversations are important, and they'd want to see a more inclusive just society where race, there isn't that sort of defensive mode towards conversations around race, because ultimately it will help us to just be given access to equal resource.
I think just jumping off the back of what Natalie said there, I think what my hope would be for the future, and I don't know how long it's going to take for us to get to this point, but I just hope that we get to a point, especially when it comes to perspective, when it comes to Black businesses and Black entrepreneurs. You know, there's been a massive push for supporting Black businesses, supporting Black entrepreneurs. I'm sure a lot of people have been aware of Black Pound Day, which has come about so that it's a specific day where, you know, you can put your money into Black businesses. My hope is that we get to a point where we don't actually have to have a day like that, because Black businesses are on par and equal with businesses run by all people across this country.
Yeah, I think a little bit to go off both what Natalie and Rita have said. I think definitely the fact it's everybody getting involved in the conversation and the movement, and understanding that it's all parts of society that need to be involved to making change happen. And linking in with what Rita said about, you know, that everything's on the same par. I think a key thing for me is that we don't separate Black history. Black history is British history, and that, you know, I really hope that we move to where but I think a part of that is actually history is told in schools and generally as a true reflection, the good, but the bad and the ugly that has happened in the past. Because there's a great quote, which is, you close an eye to the past and you're blind to the future. And I think you need to really understand, you know, if we don't understand the roots of everything, then people never really understand, well, why is this inequality? Why is the system set up this way? Whereas if we're, you know, having compulsory education around all of our history, and there's been a lot of lobbying towards that. So my hope would be that there's more integration into history lessons, so that people understand how we've got to the point that we're at. Because I think if you've got that shared understanding, then you can have even more productive and better conversations about the way forward.
Just really fascinating. I think the conversation could go on a lot longer for me to unpick some of the nuggets that you've all been able to share, because the subject that you're talking about are very emotive, because it's a lived experience, and I'm fascinated how you create that space for the dialogue. My hope is, with all the work that you're doing, that it's a dialogue, not a debate, because if you frame things in a debate, there's only a right and wrong way to see things. That carries on the argument, and then you can end up polarizing, pulling people wider apart instead of bringing them together. So more power to your elbows for taking on this emotional work. So, you know, please keep us informed in the work that you do, and if we can help with it. But thank you, all. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.